Today is August 31st, and this is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. Ever since I was in college as a teenager, I've had to deal with discussions in which people question the existence of God. Does God exist? Whether God exists. And everyone gives their thoughts and their arguments, pro and con, for whether they think God exists or doesn't exist. And I've been listening to these discussions for almost 30 years now. And I have to admit that when I think back through my life, all the way back to my conversion when I was 18 years old, I don't think I ever spent any time asking myself whether or not I thought that God exists. I never really argued about that with myself. I never struggled with that question, whether God exists. And that's one of the reasons why when I hear people talking about that, I think it's a waste of time. Because I really don't think that the question of God's existence, even though there are all of these popular and common discussions of the existence of God, I don't think that the question really makes any sense. I think it's an excuse more than anything to go on living a certain kind of life that one wants to live. Because the truth of the existence of God immediately leads us to the second question, which is, what is His will? What does He intend for us to do? And that's the real issue. I don't think anyone would be upset to learn that there was indeed a Spirit who fills the universe, who created the world and created all things and sustains all things. There's nothing offensive about the existence of God. And so I think when people pretend that they're hung up on the question of God's existence, I think that that's a distraction. Because the real issue is the next question. What is His will? That's what people are trying to avoid. Because if we think about what God is, just in terms of His essence, as St. Thomas explained, God is that beyond which nothing greater can possibly exist. Once we start with that definition of God and then begin to think through the details, well, would God be like this or like this? Would God be like this or like that? We begin to form a necessary idea of the character of God, and the truth is, people don't like that. They don't like a God who is just. They don't like a God who is chaste and pure. They don't like a God who is merciful. They don't like a God who is truthful, and so on. Because when we're tempted or pressed to do certain things, the thought that God does not approve of those things becomes a source of frustration. And this knowledge of God is standing in the way of us and our will. And so we choose to simply deny the existence of God and pretend that we're serious about that. And if you really step away from all of the fake philosophizing and the fake reasoning, if you step back and just think about the issue honestly, you realize how ridiculous it is for any of us to talk about whether we think God exists or not. I mean, just think about how weak the argument is. When someone suggests something like, well, I have no evidence. I have never observed anything that demonstrates God to exist. Think of how ridiculous it is to even let that come out of your mouth. Most of us have not observed much of anything that exists. I've never observed Scotland for myself. And yet if I said that, I have a hard time believing that Scotland exists because I've never seen it, I've never been there, Scotland has never come to me and presented itself to me and proven its existence, so I have to withhold judgment on the existence of Scotland because it's ridiculous. And that would be true of anything. And so to make our observation, our experience, the measure of the truth of the existence of it, that's just not a real argument. It's ridiculous. And it's even more ridiculous and irrational when you realize that by definition, God is an invisible, imperceptible spirit. So when it comes to observation, what are we even talking about? It doesn't make any sense to say, well, here's my big silver bullet. I've never seen God. How stupid an argument is that? A stupid argument. Doesn't even make any sense. God is an invisible spirit. Obviously, you haven't observed him with your senses. That doesn't prove anything. And even if God was a perceptible bodily being, the fact that you haven't perceived that body would not make for a good argument that the body did not exist. It's a terrible argument. So that talk about never experiencing, or I've never seen it, or God has never this or that, that's just silliness. But I think that the foolishness of this argument, the foolishness of the denial of the existence of God really comes down to something else. And it relates to that argument about having never seen God, or have never heard God speak to oneself or anything like that. There is a problem with that argument because in history, there are people who have said otherwise. There are people who have said that they did see God, or that they did speak to God, or that God did reveal himself to them. Therefore, this argument about not seeing God doesn't get us off the hook. Because there are human beings throughout history who deny this and say that they have seen God himself. So what this really comes down to, anyone who denies the existence of God is really calling any person who claims to have seen or communicated with God a liar. And that's why this discussion is not so innocent. When a person stands up and says, I've never seen God, I've never been spoken to by God, I've asked God many times to reveal himself to me or to speak to me or to allow me to see that he exists, and There's never been a response to that. Therefore, I conclude that God exists. We have to realize that there are many people who raise their hand and say, I have an objection because I have seen him. He spoke to me. And these are people who have lived throughout history. For example, Moses. The prophet Moses claims in the first books of the Old Testament that God spoke to him. He claims that God appeared to him in a burning bush and spoke to him and told him his name. Moses writes around 1400 BC, Moses writes that the creator of the world performed perceptible miracles in Egypt that everyone saw. Moses testifies that he did in fact see and speak to God. And therefore any person who says, I do not believe that God exists, asserts that Moses is lying. Lying about what he saw, lying about what he heard. And so this person who claims to be unable to judge because he has not observed is ignoring the fact that he is judging. He's judging Moses to be a liar. He's judging the Hebrew scriptures to be false. And Moses isn't the only one. We can go into other books of the Bible, read the writings of other prophets, of David the psalmist, of Solomon, and we read again and again men and women testifying that they saw God, or an angel was revealed to them, or God spoke to them, or they witnessed a miracle. And the modern denier of the existence of God says what they say is not true. And yet, he pretends to be someone who doesn't wish to judge. Yet he is judging. He's judging every person who claims to have seen and heard. And so it's not so innocent. And so what it comes down to for a third person in this discussion is that we hear Mr. Joe Schmo, 28 years old, living in New Jersey, saying, I, Joe Schmo, have never seen God. I have never spoken to God. God has never spoken to me. I've never seen a miracle. Therefore, I have no reason to believe that God exists. That testimony stands on one side, Joe Schmo, and on the other side stands Moses, who says, I saw God appear to me in a burning bush. I heard God speak to me. I saw God perform miraculous works. And we've got these two men who testify to us, Joe Schmo and Moses. And everyone who would deny that God exists calls Moses a liar, accuses Moses of lying. They accuse Moses of lying. Now, normally, if someone is accused of some evil, the burden of proof is on the person who makes the accusation. We say that a person is innocent until proven guilty. On what grounds would a person justly accuse Moses of lying? I mean, after all, a person who denies the existence of God is calling Moses a false prophet, a liar. What would the evidence be by which he proved that Moses was in fact lying? Would his evidence be, well, I didn't see it? Could you imagine a court case today where there was a murder or a bank robbery and someone said, Mr. Jones over here said he saw what happened. He saw this person fighting with this person, then he heard a scream and he saw this person run away. He says that that man murdered this man. Could you imagine someone standing up in the court and saying, well, I didn't see that, therefore it can't possibly be true? That would never happen. And yet this is what happens when men commonly and casually deny God. Call Moses and the prophets and every other religious person who's ever claimed to have experienced the presence of God, calls them all liars and cannot provide any evidence to suggest that they are in fact lying about what they claim to have seen. How can that stand? How can that argument be accepted? You're a liar because I didn't see what you claim to have seen. You're a liar because I didn't hear what you claim to have heard. What kind of crazy argument is that? It's an impossible argument to prove, and yet that's what's really being done by everyone who denies the testimony of the Scriptures. They're not these reasonable, impartial individuals reserving judgment. Although they pretend that's what they are, that's not what they are. In fact, they're the opposite. They are men who take it upon themselves to judge, and they judge not just Moses, not just the prophets, but thousands of men through history. Men of the greatest influence, men whose character has been proven most honest, most just, most credible. Dismiss them all as liars. And so the denial of the existence of God is not some innocent position. It's an indefensible position that really no one can explain, a position that cannot possibly be accepted. And I think we need to emphasize this in these discussions because we allow this fake innocence to be presented when we should ask, on what grounds do you deny the testimony of all of these people who claim to have seen and heard these things?